Welcome to Great Business Stories, and this episode is called Sip or Sink, the story behind New Coke's epic fail. And believe me, it was epic. This is the story of how in 1985, Coke's superstar CEO, the man who could do no wrong, decided to replace the 100-year-old Coke formula with a new, sweeter tasting Coke. Who was the CEO, and what were the reasons that led to his decision? Why was there such an intense backlash? And how did Coke not anticipate the backlash? Was it all just a conspiracy? It was definitely one of the worst product launches in consumer history, and it makes for a great story. So we hope you enjoy it. Morning, Keith.
Good morning, Cayman. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. And today we're going to be talking about New Coke, and this was your pick. So why did you choose this?
A couple of different reasons, really, I suppose. One is, in retrospect, it seems like one of the more bizarre business decisions that almost seems unthinkable in retrospect. But then, a lot of mistakes. I think it's safe to say this was a mistake. Do seem kind of faintly ridiculous or impossible in retrospect. And then I guess the other part of it is it was such a huge blunder by a consistently successful company that it seemed peculiar to me in speaking with a few different people that they weren't even aware that it had happened, particularly people of a younger generation. So not only was it a potentially huge blunder, but it seems to have been forgotten. So I thought to myself, this could be a really interesting story, and we've an opportunity perhaps to bring it to the awareness of people who maybe didn't even know that it happened. So that's my motivation for the story.
Yeah, I knew about it, but I can see why it's been forgotten because it lasted only 76 days from the introduction of New Coke to the time that it was pulled, that we'll get into. And I suppose for listeners who mightn't be aware of what it was basically back in the mid-80s, Coke decided to bring out a new Coke, but not only did they decide to bring out a new Coke, they also decided to pull and take off market original Coke. And as Keith rightly said, it was a blunder of monumental proportions and by a CEO who was so good and continued to be so good. He was one of the best CEOs of the 20th century. So it makes it all the more surprising that such an established company with such a heritage could do something so drastic. And yes, as we shall see, they still recovered from it, but it was, for those 76 days, I think America was consumed by Coke, and it was so interesting. And what about your sources? What did you use for your sources?
Yeah, so the actual number of official books that dealt with the story directly is small. I mean, it tends to be referenced in larger books around Coca-Cola because it's such an epic sort of institution at this point. And it's because it's very associated with the discipline of marketing, there's quite a bit of material around that. But the only book that I could find, and it was reasonably short actually, was written by Thomas Oliver, and it's called The Real Coke, The Real Story. And it dealt with the events leading up to, during, and then after the transition and about face of New Coke. And what I would say is it was very interesting for me to understand the power of the distributors and bottlers of Coca-Cola and how the organizations are very different. So we might just kind of dip into that too, because I think that's an interesting story in and of itself.
It is. And we will obviously, I'd say at some stage, do an episode on Coke and do an episode on Pepsi, and we won't be able to get into all the history of them today. But in terms of my sources, like you said, there wasn't a whole lot of material on this because it did only last for 76 days. There were lots of short articles saying this was the biggest marketing blunder ever, but not a whole lot of really deep dives. But I did manage to find a good few things, all right, through various documentaries that were on it. And Mother Jones had an excellent article written by Tim O'Malley, which he wrote recently. I think it was after New Coke was reintroduced on a limited basis after it was shown on Stranger Things. He had an article called New Coke Didn't Fail, It Was Murdered. His article kind of focused on the fact that it was a more political kind of article, although he did have some very good business information in there as well. His thesis was that New Coke was an early sign of the culture wars that we're familiar with now. It's a very interesting article. And then Business Wars, which is a Wondery podcast, they had a 5-part or 5 episodes on New Coke. So kudos to them. So New Coke was, when it came out, was such a big story. And the reason it was such a big story was because of the heritage behind Coke. And as I said, while we're not going to get into the whole Coke history, I think we'll just very quickly go through how Coke was formed and why it had this amazing heritage. The little bit I have here was that the formula was created in 1886 by Doc Pemberton down in Atlanta, but poor old Doc didn't really live to see its success. And I don't think if Doc had lived that he would have made Coke a success.
Yeah.
A pretty checkered history in terms of making successful products. But it was taken over after his death by Asa Candler, a very good marketer and a pharmacist as well from Atlanta. He bought it for about $2,300. And I think there was a bit of shenanigans in his purchase of it, in that he bought the formula and then he had to buy the name. So it was a bit finicky there. But he took it over, made a success of it. But the real success and the real growth came, and you mentioned them earlier on there, was when 2 guys decided they wanted to bottle Coke. And so they went to Asa Candler and said, we want to bottle Coke. They signed an agreement with Asa Candler. He gave them the rights to bottle it. They opened up a bottling company, and then they sold the rights to bottle Coke all over America. And this is what really spread Coke. This is what made Coke such a big brand initially. By 1909, there were Coke bottlers in 350 different towns and cities in America. By 1920, there were 1,200 bottlers across America. And that's what sealed Coke's success.
And just to maybe talk about that, for people who are not familiar with it, it would have started off as it's almost a medicinal product.
Yes.
And sold as a dilutable syrup then. So it was the syrup that was kind of sold. Is that correct?
That's it. It was sold in soda fountains, where they'd get the syrup and then they'd put in the carbonated water themselves. So the bottlers went with this idea. Asa Candler apparently didn't see the potential in bottling it, but it proved to be a huge success. But the real growth then came when Asa Candler sold Coke in 1919 for $25 million back then, which is the equivalent of about $1 billion in today's money. So he made a pretty penny from it.
Yeah.
And it was taken over by a group of industrialists, and one of the industrialists put his son, a guy called Robert Woodruff, in charge in 1920. And it was Woodruff who really oversaw Coke's huge growth, not just in America, but also worldwide. It was Woodruff who harnessed the link between Santa and Coke, because Coke sales were slow in the winter. So he developed this campaign that linked Coke with Santa. And prior to Coke, Santa did exist, but he wasn't this big, jolly, red-cheeked man in pristine red and white. He came in all shapes and sizes. But Coke developed this Santa that we now are familiar with. He also got Coke involved in World War II by cuddling up with the government and lobbying the government. And Coke was the only company in America that didn't have any sugar rationing during World War II, because he promised that every soldier in America would be able to get their hands on a bottle of Coke. And to do this, the government funded Coke, build bottling plants all around the world during the war, so that when the war was over then, Coke had already made
Here imperialist footprint.
Yes, all over the world. And this allowed their international expansion. And it was also crucially why I mentioned Woodruff. It was Woodruff who really built the mythology around the Coke formula. It was him who endorsed this idea that the Coke formula was this special formula, that only 2 people in the company at any one time knew the formula, that it was hidden away in a secret vault in a bank. So there was always this mystique around the formula. And I remember growing up hearing about, the Coke formula, and only 2 people know about it.
And they're not allowed to travel together or...
Yes.
So it's a bit like the KFC sort of spice blend formula as well. There's a lot of these sorts of mythologies.
I was trying to think, I was asking Susie, my daughter, what other company has that kind of build up that mythology. Now, I don't think anybody had it harnessed as completely as Coke. But you're right, there's KFC, there's dairy milk, 2 glasses of milk in every
yeah.
That kind of thing. But Coke, more than anybody else, I think, really built the mythology around their formula, which is why I underline it, because, of course, we go on to find out that they changed their formula all of a sudden.
Yeah.
But so in the 50s and 60s, Coke is outselling Pepsi by 6 to 1. But it changes a little bit in the 1950s to 1970s because the suburban population in the USA doubled. And as a result, you have supermarkets overtaking these corner shops that used to be the mainstay for, Coke sales. And so these supermarkets offer a far wider range of products. They also offer private label products. So this eats into Coke's market share. But more than that, what really hurts Coke as we go on into the 70s and 80s is that Pepsi starts to gain traction, because up to this point, Pepsi was very much seen as the poor man's cola. But in 1963, Pepsi launched their Generation campaign. And throughout the 60s and 70s, the Generation campaign started making big inroads, whereas before Coke was outselling Pepsi 6-1. By 1975, the Coke sales were about 1.1 billion cases a year, and Pepsi was now up to 775 million. So Pepsi was nipping on their heels. But then in 1975, and I think you might be able to talk a little bit about this as well, in 1975, Pepsi launched their Pepsi Challenge.
Yes, yeah, and that seems to be one of the big spurs. But really, when I read about the Generation, I think what was really clever about it, it's almost like, well, Coke was your mum and dad's drink. You're an individual. You're new. You're an independent person. It's almost like don't vote the same way as your parents do. Don't drink the same soda. And I think it was really fundamentally very clever.
I think it is. And I mentioned the Generation one because I'm going to bring up the Generation a good bit in this conversation, because I think the Generation campaign, we can see that, Coke was outselling Pepsi 6-1 before the Generation. And within 12 years, Pepsi was nipping at their heel. And it was the Generation campaign. It was apparently one of the very best examples of lifestyle marketing back then.
Yes.
Because as you said, it was targeted at the youth. It was targeted at this aspirational lifestyle. If you consider yourself young and active and progressive, then you're part of the Pepsi generation. And it was hugely effective.
Yes.
And they didn't stop it. When they brought out the Pepsi Challenge, the Generation campaign continued for decades, but then they brought out the Pepsi Challenge. And
and I think it was very clever. The Pepsi Challenge, I've still seen it actually over here. So it's still on the go. And that's just very
still on the go.
Yeah. They'll still use it. I've seen it on the outdoor on 6 sheets at bus stops, where what they'll do is they put up a picture of Pepsi. I think it might be Pepsi Max recently. And then a generic kind of unbranded red can. And it'll say 80% of users prefer the taste of Pepsi.
Yeah.
So it's such a valuable marketing tool that they use it heavily.
Yeah, but the Pepsi Challenge that they started out in 1975 was, for listeners who don't know, I remember it because it kept on going until the 80s, and you'd actually see the TV ads. But it's where Pepsi went into shopping centers or shopping malls, and you'd see all the people around, and they just basically sit at the table, and somebody would sit down and they'd say, okay, well, it was a blind taste test.
Yes.
Coke and Pepsi. So you didn't know what you were drinking, and people would sip both, and Pepsi were able to say that more often than not, people preferred Pepsi. It was a real confrontational and pretty ballsy kind of taunt to Coke. It was like, look, people prefer our drink to your drink.
Yes.
And it really enraged Coke, because it just threw down the gauntlet to them, and it did have big impact. I mean, the stat I have is that by 1978, whereas we had Pepsi at 775 million cases versus 1.1 billion against Coke, within 3 years, Pepsi were just under 1 billion. And Coke stayed static at 1.1 billion. But again, the Generation campaign was also running while this was happening. I think when I read people saying, sales increased 30% because of the Pepsi Challenge, I'm kind of going, no, the Generation campaign, which had been working all the way up along, was still going as well. And I think that's important as we talk about this further.
It is. And I think the other kind of interesting phenomenon is the extent to which Coke's distribution is beyond just those sort of cases. Maybe that's just how they count their distribution. But if we think about Belgians in cinemas and fast food, they have a huge distribution across a number of different customer touch points.
Apologies for the interruption. I'd like to tell you very quickly how we plan to grow great business stories, how you can help us, and what you'll get in return. Due to the huge amount of research undertaken for each episode, for now we can release only one episode on the first of every month. But if we can get enough supporters to donate just $3 per month, we'll be able to release a second episode every month. This second monthly episode will be behind a paywall, but your $3 monthly subscription will give you access to these episodes when we eventually release them. So that's what we're building towards. But for now, when you subscribe for $3 a month, you get the following benefits. You get to listen to great business stories without hearing this message. You get access to one bonus episode. It's a cracking story called The $4.5 billion 1MDB Heist, how Joe Low and the Prime Minister stole a fortune. And finally, as a supporter, on the first of every month, the same days that we release a new episode, you'll get one email with one link to an amazing in-depth article exploring a great story. And while our Twitter feed, which is @biz, B-I-Z, Story Podcast, regularly shares links to great business stories, the one delivered via email will be a bit special. So to help us release 2 episodes a month, to listen to that bonus episode, and to receive a link to a great business story article in your inbox once a month, go to greatbusinessstories.supercast.com, and there's a link to it in the description. Thank you. They do, and that was the tipping point for Coke, in that when they got to the 80s, they still had the market share, but only by a few percentage points. And what was keeping Coke at the top was the McDonald's and the Hardee's, these large fast food restaurants that did have Coke as their main drink. But in actual supermarket sales by this time, Pepsi was outselling Coke. So when it actually came to consumer choice, Pepsi was in the lead. So this was putting huge pressure on Coke, especially now. Coke was coming up to its centenary in 1986, and the last thing they wanted was to be knocked off their top spot as the number one cola brand when it came to their centenary. So there was an awful lot of pressure on Coke to do something about this. And actually, just on the Pepsi challenge, because you might be thinking, well, how do we know the Pepsi challenge actually worked? Well, Coke themselves did their own in-house Pepsi challenge, and the stat they found was that when they did the Pepsi challenge, that Pepsi was preferred by 58%. Versus 42%. So this wasn't people, and this is an important point, drinking a full can of Pepsi and then drinking a full can of Coke. This is where people just had a little sip of Pepsi and a little sip of Coke. And that's an important point that we'll talk about later as well.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting one, because that theme of research and confidence in the research is a huge part of that decision to go with Coke.
Yeah.
So they felt really that the facts and the research and the feedback made the decision, a no-brainer to a certain extent.
Well, as we see in the press conference that they have when they're launching new Coke, that was their mantra. It was the consumers and it was the taste test that told us that this was the best drink. So they were very much data-driven, and that was probably one of the reasons why it was.
100%. I guess the other context around here that is interesting to understand the confidence in decision making is probably the extent to which some of the non-core business investments that Coke made, particularly around film distribution.
Well, this is what I was going to get to, because I wanted to lay the foundation for this, because the characters involved here, up to the 60s and 70s, Coke very much seen it was viewed as a very slow-paced, conservative, bureaucratic company, and it made decisions really slowly. Now, it had grown significantly still over the 60s and 70s in terms of overall sales. I checked that up, but the image of Coke as a company was that it was slow-paced and stodgy. So Woodruff, who wasn't in charge anymore but was still very much in control, he knew that he needed a breath of fresh air. He needed something really, really different, somebody new to shake things up. And up to this stage, not only had every Coke chief or CEO been American, they'd also all been from Georgia. And all of a sudden, he chose a guy called Roberto Guizetta, who's a Cuban native, to be the next CEO. Now, Guizetta hadn't come out of nowhere. He rose up through the ranks. He became the youngest vice president at the age of 35. When he was a chemical engineer educated in Yale, and he had also implemented some very, very good strategies while he was chief technology officer in Coke. So he had made a name for himself and caught the eye of Woodruff, but it was still very much a surprise when he was chosen. I remember I read an article before they made the decision on who was the successor, and the article from New York Times named the 6 main candidates that were going up for this role, and Gozetta wasn't in the 6.
I think his right-hand person was his biggest rival, wasn't it? Donald Keogh or...
This Don Keogh, who comes across, I really like this guy. About him. And Keogh actually, he was a smart cookie. He's a best friend of Warren Buffett and lived across the street from Warren Buffett. And I saw...
He was a huge investor in Coca-Cola as well.
Yes. And Warren Buffett, you say that at his annual, not his annual meeting where there are thousands of people, but he'd have an annual get-together with a handful of top business people like Bill Gates. And at every one of these annual meetings, they all just wanted Don Keogh to be the keynote speaker because he was so eloquent. He was a really, really good speaker. But he obviously knew that the writing was on the wall, because a few weeks before they named the successor, he cornered Gozetta at a meeting and said, if I get the top job, I'll make you my number 2.
Yeah.
If you get the top job, you'll make me my number 2. And they made a deal. And Gozetta got the top job. Keogh became second in command, and they were a formidable duo. And so Gozetta, as you rightly say, they'd made a lot of moves. As soon as he came into power, he said straight off, he said, there's going to be no sacred cows. He even made a point of saying, even the formulas of our products are up for grabs here. Now, I don't think anybody thought that he would actually, follow through in that change of form. But anyway, he did say that. He moved fast. He put in a centralized, decentralized strategy for all operations, where he standardized everything from accounting to procurement across all Coke's businesses around the world, made huge cost savings. He met with the bottlers, because the bottlers were very much the poor partner of Coke, even though they were very, very influential. I don't think they felt they were getting the respect. And I know you probably know a bit more about this. By the time he was in power as well, an awful lot of them were third generation bottlers, and some of them hadn't any interest in the business anymore. And so,
but they had very advantageous contracts in a lot of cases, where they fixed price contracts with a syrup. So they had a lot of leverage and a lot of influence at the same time.
Yeah, they were all independent, weren't they?
Yeah. At that point, they were. Yeah,
they were. And I think Gozetta said, "Look, whoever wants out, we'll buy you out." And he bought an awful lot of them out, invested money into them, put in new equipment, and then sold them back to the more ambitious bottlers that wanted to grow their business.
Yeah, it's very much, it feels very much like a franchise type model, really.
Yeah. He also made a point. He said to the bottlers at that time, as soon as he came into power, I am going to listen to you guys. Whatever you guys say, I am going to take heed. And in fairness, he seemed to come through with that, as we'll see later on. He also gave them the ability to replace sugar with high fructose corn syrup.
Very controversial.
Very controversial, allowed them to make huge savings. But again, it shows that he was willing to make changes to the ingredients. Now, that apparently didn't change the taste of Coke, but it did change the ingredients. So it shows.
Or
did it?
Well, I think there's different opinions on that. So in America, Mexican Coke is still made with cane sugar. And that, as a product line, the imported Mexican Coke today in America is a very popular product. And it does taste differently. I haven't tried it myself. It's more expensive. It's imported. It's labeled differently. But it does have a slightly, to my mind now, maybe it's a psychological thing, because it was in a different bottle and I was expecting it to taste different.
Yes. What do they call it? Sensation transference is what Malcolm
said. So maybe that's what it was. But that was a very controversial decision, not least because, quote unquote, Big Sugar got involved in the decision and tried to argue that this wasn't sugar at all. And the claim that the ingredients hadn't changed and it was still sugar, albeit from a different source, was heavily contested by Big Sugar at the time.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't an uncontroversial. It might seem like small to us, but it wasn't an uncontroversial decision.
No, and it also shows, though, that Gozetta was on for taking these kinds of risks. And he took other risks. He brought in Diet Coke in 1982, which prior to this, that was anathema to Coke, because Pepsi had brought out Diet Pepsi 18 years previously. But there was a feeling within Coke that Coke was this sacred brand and you couldn't bring any other drink under the Coke brand. Guizetta saw it as a totally opposite way, which I'll talk about later when we talk about his mega brand strategy. But he brought in Diet Coke in 1982. Within 3 years, Diet Coke was the third best-selling soft drink in the US behind Pepsi and Coke.
Because they had Tab as well, don't forget.
They did have Tab, and that's why Tab was being outsold like massively by Diet Pepsi, because Diet Pepsi was under the Pepsi brand.
That brand recognition.
Yeah.
Or Tab was just a
Tab
unknown.
Yeah. But then
and cherry Coke as well, don't forget that. That was a hugely successful product.
I never understand that.
I'd still be it up,
And Cherry Coke. Well, Cherry Coke came out in 85, just before New Coke. So yeah,
right.
So he brought out all these other caffeine-free Diet Coke, caffeine-free normal Coke. So he brought out a number of Cokes under the Coke umbrella. And then he also, as you said, in 1982, I thought was bizarre, he bought Columbia Studios for $750 million.
Yes.
Was there much in the book as to, I mean, I read that he just wanted to diversify their earnings, and that was really the main reason for it. But
I just think it was, the book does touch on it as sort of a puzzling investment that the investment community scorned and thought was ludicrous. It seemed like a bizarre investment that had very little to do with the core business. And the early predictions were that it would cost Coca-Cola a fortune. And the fact that it did the opposite and was profitable probably fueled the confidence in decision-making that led to the new Coke kind of decision as well.
I think you're right. I mean, eventually they ended up selling Columbia to Sony in 1987 for $3 billion. They bought it for $750 million. So yeah, it obviously was a good investment. But I think you're right. I think that decision and the fact that that investment went so well, coupled with the fact that Diet Coke was going so well, he was making a lot of big decisions, and they were all coming out trumps for him. And the share price in his first 4 to 5 years had tripled. So Guizetta was on the rise and everything was going well, except for the fact that by 1984, Coke now only had 21.7% market share and Pepsi had 19.8%. And the people in Coke were asking themselves, we've got twice as many vending machines. We got soda fountains in the biggest restaurant chains in the country. We have more shelf space on the supermarkets. We're spending $100 million more on advertising than Pepsi every year. How are they catching us?
Yeah.
And they thought, because the Pepsi challenge was so, I think this is my take on it, because the Pepsi challenge was so much in their face, it was such a visible public challenge. And because as well, Diet Coke had done so well, and Diet Coke was this sweeter taste as well. And because I think Guizetta didn't come from a marketing background, he came from a chemical engineer background. I think there's a load of factors that fed into this idea that maybe we should be changing the taste. Maybe the taste is the problem. And Guizetta actually had put in place a team to look for a new taste as soon as he came into power. But it wasn't until 1984 that this team came back to him and said, we think we've got a good formula here.
Yeah. I think there's a bit of mythologizing around that as well, though. Where it's like, we just stumbled in the lab when we were trying to come up with the formula for one of our diet products. We stumbled onto this new formula.
Yeah.
And we thought this is an aha moment.
Yeah, so again, they kind of present like a holy grail nearly.
Yeah, so you could imagine it kind of being part of that mythology had it been successful. So we had the old formula in the lab and in the safe, and then we stumbled on an even better one. So our luck is, so incredible. We just stumbled across this accidentally, and now it's in the safe. It seemed to me like it was quite a deliberate effort to try and develop a new formula. I don't believe for a second somebody just stumbled on it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was probably a lot more deliberate than that. But anyway, that's the way they portrayed the story, and I couldn't find anything else. I suppose only the people involved would know, and they haven't come out to say exactly what happened. But on the back of, anyway, them finding this miraculous new formula, they started this new project called Project Kansas, where Guzzetta got his top marketing people to form a secret group, top secret group. It was called
Yes.
Project Kansas after a Kansas newspaper editor and Pulitzer Prize winning author, William Allen White. There's a famous picture of him that hangs in the Coke headquarters of him drinking a bottle of Coke. So that's why they called it Project Kansas.
Really?
Yeah. And he also had a famous quote about how Coke was the ultimate in American sort of consumerism, and it was the perfect drink.
It's weird. My mind immediately went to Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. Sort of, we're not in Kansas now. Totally.
No.
So, maybe that sense of, oh God, this isn't exactly where I thought we'd be after the success, but there you go, or lack of success, really.
Exactly. But it was top secret. It was secret even to the point that their ad agency, McCann Erickson, people who worked on that would go into McCann Erickson during the day, and then in the evenings, supposedly they were heading home, but they wouldn't. They'd reconvene at a secret location.
Yeah.
It was manned by security people and shredders at the door. No documents were allowed out. So it was so hush-hush. They likened this in the Coke Museum. They have papers on it where it was likened at the time to the Normandy invasion. Now, an exaggeration, of course, but in terms of the resources that they put into this, like, it was huge. Like, they was it 200,000 taste tests they did with new Coke. Massive. Hundreds and hundreds of focus groups, thousands and thousands of surveys. It was a huge operation. And of course, one of the big questions they had to ask, when they decided, okay, we've got this, it's the holy grail, it's beating Pepsi, and it was beating Pepsi on their taste. So they said, we're going to go ahead with this, but they had one big question, of course. What are we going to do with the original Coke? Are we going to discontinue it, or are we going to launch this new Coke with the original Coke? It was a huge decision, and they decided to discontinue it, which I can't.
No, I just can't reconcile my head to that one at all.
I mean, I have the reasons here, the reasons they gave, but none of them are that great. Well, one of them is okay. One of them was that the bottlers would kick up because they'd have 2 Cokes now to do, and that would put more pressure on their production line. And you're kind of going, yeah, but Guzzetta had already brought in Diet Coke, caffeine-free Diet Coke, caffeine-free Coke. Yeah, another one, it wouldn't make that much difference. That was one reason. Okay? Fair enough. Not great. The other reason given, which was a good reason, is that if you had both Coke, would they not cannibalize each other, and would that not give Pepsi the number 1 position? So, okay, I could see that, especially coming up to their centenary, they wanted Coke, the one Coke, to be the number 1 cola, and maybe the two of them would cannibalize each other and Pepsi would get the jump on them. Fair enough. The other issue or dilemma they had was, what one would McDonald's choose, and what problems would that cause them?
Yeah.
So they had that. But at the same time, you have millions and millions of people who love your drink, and you're just going to take it off them? Like, that
I know.
And another dilemma they had was, how are they going to market this new Coke? Because remember, they'd had nearly 100 years of Coke is it. Coke is the real thing. This heritage of the formula, this mystique behind the formula. And even just the year previous to the launch of new Coke, they ran out a huge campaign with Bill Cosby on TV, where Bill Cosby more or less derided Pepsi and all the other colas for being too sweet.
Too sweet.
Yeah. And now they were bringing out this new Coke, which its only determining factor that differentiated it from the old Coke was that it was much sweeter. So now they did come up with a line which was good. Their tagline for new Coke, which was good, but it just couldn't paper over the cracks that all the issues that were going to come out. But their tagline was, for new Coke, the best just got better.
Yes.
Yeah. Which is nice,
It is nice. It is nice. That's the extraordinary thing about it. I mean, so many smart, well-paid people generated such data that kept them all of the reassurance that this was the right decision. So it's hard not to be sympathetic in that respect. They're looking at these facts. They feel like they're on the right track. The data from consumers looks like it's right.
Yeah.
So you're on the precipice of this huge decision. They must have been feeling very confident.
They were feeling very confident. They were feeling extremely confident. And Guzzetta and Keogh went to the bottlers the day before they did the big new Coke launch, told the bottlers what they were doing. Bottlers gave them a standing ovation. The bottlers were delighted because after years and years of Pepsi catching up to them, and after years and years of, I suppose, working with a very bureaucratic, slow-paced Coke, they finally had this man, Guzetta, who was making fast changes, big risks. All the risks were paying off. And now his new risk was to take the old formula off the table, bring out this new formula that their tests had shown and their research had shown was beating Pepsi. And, so Guzetta and Keogh were going into that press conference on the 23rd of April, having met the bottlers, all of confidence. Not only had their own research proven that this was the right thing, but their main partner, the bottlers, had given them a huge vote of confidence that, yes, you're doing the right thing. But what they didn't realize, despite all the secrecy, was that the Pepsi CEO, a young fella by the name of Roger Enrico, had gotten the heads up that new Coke was going to be launched. Apparently, there was an insider inside in Coke, which is codenamed, I kid you not, Deep Palace. And Deep Palace had been in contact with Enrico and given him the heads up that this was coming down the line. Now, Enrico initially it obviously frightened him because he thought, wait a second, if new Coke beats Pepsi in the Pepsi Challenge, we're in big trouble here. But the more he and his executives thought about it, the more they realized, hold on a second. What's actually happened here is
Coke scared.
Yeah, Coke have caved. Coke have given in. Coke have thrown away 100 years of heritage, 100 years of their, we're the best, to just try and compete with Pepsi. They've sweetened their drink to compete with Pepsi. As Enrico said, famously, the other guy blinked, and that's exactly what happened. And what Enrico did then was he got his PR team contact all the journalists that were going to be at the press conference of the Coke launch, and they prepped them with kind of questions that they should be asking Guzetta and Keogh. In other words, that this is all about the Pepsi Challenge. They've only sweetened Coke so that they can compete with Pepsi. And so when Keogh and Guzetta got up and made their big announcement and said the best just got better, straight away the journalists just started peppering them with, hold on a second, isn't it just sweeter? Haven't you just, made Coke sweeter? Isn't just a response to the Pepsi Challenge? And in the whole, I don't know how long the press conference went on for, I think it was an hour or so, Guzetta never once mentioned the word sweet or sweeter or anything like that. He used words like that new Coke was deeper. It was round. It was more harmonious. Whereas everyone and their dog knew that, no, it's just sweeter, man. And so the media had straight away had their story that Coke had caved. And not only that, but Pepsi also brought out a full-page ad in New York Times that same day to really gazump Coke. And the main tagline on their New York Times ad was, the other guy blinked. And Enrico went on to TV stations all that day with the same line saying, the other guy blinked. And also another nice line I had from Pepsi was that victory is sweet.
Very clever.
Very clever. Yeah. And they also had a celebration of their own 5 kilometers down the road from the press conference that New Coke had. And they gave their staff the day off as well to celebrate Pepsi's victory. So they really gazumped Coke on this. Like, it was very
Wow.
Yeah.
But it wasn't long before they knew they were in trouble. So the consumer backlash is really the most remarkable thing here, I think. One of the anecdotes in the book that really stood out to me was a guy several states away who rented a U-Haul truck. As supplies of Coca-Cola Original started to dwindle in his local supermarket, he actually drove to other states, stocking up and filling his garage with Coke. He didn't drink alcohol. He didn't drink anything else. That's all he drank. He didn't drink water. And there was panic. There was like consumer outrage that this institution was changing.
There was. And the article that I referenced, Tim O'Malley's Mother Jones article, he frames it as a culture war. And I love the article. I think it was a really well-written piece. And there was some truth in it. There were some people who were jumping on the bandwagon because they just didn't want change for change's sake. You will have that. But I think where Tim O'Malley gets it wrong, and he even mentioned he was interviewed in the Business Movers podcast that I referenced as well. And Tim said in that podcast, he said, soda is just soda. And that's where I kind of stopped. And I said, hold on a second. Because when I was young, I was a big Coke drinker.
Yes.
And I love Coke. And for me, soda wasn't just soda. There was Coke, and if somebody gave me Pepsi, I mightn't recognize it after one or two sips, but after, half a glass, I know it was Pepsi. And an
Yeah, I think
awful
you're
lot
right.
of, an awful lot of the objections were coming from real Coke loyalists who just, as you said, like that guy there, they just drank Coke a lot, like an awful lot. And Coke was taking it away from them. It wasn't as if they were bringing out a new Coke. That would be okay. Grand, bring out 10 new Cokes. But to take away my Coke, God.
I know. And I think it felt more, I mean, I don't know for you, but I can remember when you're drinking it as a kid, it almost felt as if it was some sort of mythical connection to America. It was almost like
Yes.
associated with Americana
Yeah.
in a way I can't think of any other product.
No.
I don't, not that I can think of anyway. So it seemed to be a part of American identity for a huge amount of people, the baby boomers, etc., who saw
Yeah.
this product as, part of their identity and
Yeah.
part of their heritage. And suddenly it's been torn up. It's like the flag or something,
Yeah. And they were getting tens of thousands of calls and letters, like
Sure.
thousands out every day into the office, like saying, what are you doing? What are you doing? And of course, as well as that, one thing that I noticed, like back then you didn't have social media, but in
Yes.
1980, you had CNN launched the first 24-hour news channel. And over the coming years, you had fierce competition in the news media.
Yeah.
And so this kind of story was just the type of story that they loved. You had pictures of people on the streets buying new Coke and emptying it into the drains. You had, thousands and thousands of phone calls. So it was a story that the media definitely amplified. And that will have an important part when I look at the research, when we get to sort of post-mortem of, how this went all wrong. But, so yeah, you're right. The complaints that were piling in, as well as that, the bottlers, who Guzzetta said he would always listen to, the bottlers started getting back to Guzzetta saying, our shops are not happy taking them. Our customers coming back saying they don't like the taste of it. And Guzzetta was good on his promise. He did start listening, and very, very quickly he decided, we got to reverse this decision. And this is despite the fact, Keith, that they had like $30 million worth of new Coke syrup, that this was like the biggest product launch nearly in American consumer history. Despite the fact that this would be one of the most embarrassing flying downs, he still made the decision, we got to reverse this, and made it pretty quickly.
Yes. But it did, reversing it, yes, but not as dramatic as replacing it originally, because he did actually do probably, arguably, what he should have done in the first place, where two brands existed together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Coca-Cola Classic, which is the original, and then New Coke. So
Because that's exactly what he did. Like after 76 days, they held another press conference, and they said, we're bringing back Original Coke. We're keeping New Coke. And they called Original Coke then Classic Coke.
Yeah.
But Guzzetta still wanted to give New Coke a chance because he had all this research showing that people loved it. So he probably still thought, wait a second, I want to keep this out here, because if people love this Coke, it might still be a winner.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, because as soon as they brought out Classic Coke, McDonald's decided, okay, we're going back to the old Coke. And they started getting thousands of positive calls, thousands of letters. And there was all this goodwill and gratitude that Original Coke was coming back. And Original Coke then started taking off, and their sales started shooting through the roof again.
And then that in turn has fed into this conspiracy theory that was the plan all along. I don't know if you've read references to that.
I did. Was that heavily referenced in the book?
No, it wasn't. But reading up on different articles, they're saying this was a masterstroke. They did this deliberately. And yes, it was a huge investment in the formulation of New Coke, but it was all a charade. It was all, a publicity stunt.
Keogh addressed this, and again, Keogh, he's such a good communicator. He addressed this at the second conference where they're bringing back Original Coke, and he has this line that I think maybe most people would be able to use to dispute any conspiracy theory. And he said, we're not that dumb, and we're not that smart. And that is very true. I mean, you'd have to be either very dumb and very smart to do something like that.
Yes.
It wasn't intentional. How could it be? But yeah, they got it wrong. And there was an excellent article. It was a piece of research, and it was like, how did Coke get this wrong? Because we talked about the data, okay? And it was like, did they have all the data? Did they misinterpret the data? What was the reason that they got this so wrong? And there was one interesting point in this article. And Coke, as well as doing the taste tests, they did focus groups and they did surveys. Now, both the focus groups and the surveys found that about 10% of Coke drinkers objected very strongly against kicking out old Coke and bringing in new Coke in its place. So 10 to 12%, okay? Now, in the surveys, because the surveys are done individually, it was always 10 to 12%. In the focus groups, you would have, say, 10 people, and you would have one person, which would represent the 10% that would be really object against this. But within the focus group, that one person's objections were then taken up by about 4 people. So by the end of the focus group, you would have 4 to 5 people objecting really loudly about, no, you can't replace old Coke with new.
So they'd essentially make an argument, an emotional argument that would convince the other people in the group.
Well, yes, it's a phenomenon that we are familiar with now because of social media. It's called social influence. You get it on social media all the time, where one person objects against something, and then within a few hours, you have loads of people piling in and agreeing with this one objector, and all of a sudden, it spreads around the world, and everybody's going nuts over something of no consequence at all. But yes, so in the focus groups, that one person's influence would spread. Now, Coke obviously thought, okay, but we don't live in a focus group. So we're going to have 10% of people who aren't going to be happy. But what they hadn't factored on, and I don't blame them for this either, was the influence that the media would have on it. Because of the news channel and because the news, they kept on playing this. Like, they even interrupted news programs to bring it up Coke news. So you had this 10% who'd object, and then, of course, the media amplified it. So then you had that 10% expand up to 40%. And that was one of the reasons that caught Coke off guard. They didn't expect it to spread like that. So that was an interesting point.
And any lasting negative impact that you can kind of look at? I mean, ultimately, when the dust settles, they come out of the situation up, right? They're not
They come out very up. I suppose, I don't know about negative. I suppose one thing that you'd have to look at, like, as you said, it's hard to blame them because they had all this research, and I wouldn't even blame them for getting that 10% and saying, well, how did they not know it was going to be amplified? This was pre-social media. I don't blame them for that. The one thing I would sort of point the finger, if you were to point the finger at them, is that the generation, and I get back to the generation campaign had been going on successfully all the time, and Pepsi had been nipping at their heels and getting market share through generation. And then the Pepsi challenge came, and they made it all about taste. But generations kept on going. And I can't understand why Coke for 1 minute didn't think, hold on a second, could this be an image problem? Because even when you look at Guzzetti, who was doing great, even when he took charge, look at 1984, okay? Who was Coke's main ambassador featuring in their ads? It was Bill Cosby, Dr. Huxtable. You're talking about middle-aged, middle-class, middle of the road. Who did Pepsi have in 1984? They had Michael Jackson.
That's right.
They signed the biggest star in the world for the biggest deal at that time. They invested $7 million in 2 ads. I think one of them is where Michael Jackson burnt his hair. But you look at their image, and I can't understand for 1 second why Coke didn't stand back and say, wait a second, guys, might this be to do with our image? Because there was other research that Coke had been doing all the way along. In 1981 up to 1985, they were surveying 16,000 people, not on a taste test, just on purely which drink do you prefer. And Coke always was winning that 36 to 33%, more or less all the way through. So they didn't have a taste problem. Okay, the sip test did show it, but as Malcolm Gladwell, and we don't have time to get into that, but he does have a very good chapter in his book about how sip tests are irrelevant, especially blind sip tests, because our palates and our endorphins will always go for the sweeter taste. So taste tests don't work out. And Coke themselves knew this. When the first taste test or Pepsi challenge came out, Coke came out and said, yeah, but that's only a sip test. When people actually do the drink at home test, Coke went out. So Coke had done research to kind of show that the taste test and the blind taste test weren't relevant. I don't understand why they didn't look at the image, because
it's a good point.
Yeah. And that's the only thing I would say. But in terms of Did it have any long-lasting impact? Not at all. It
And not
actually,
the executives who were responsible for the decision either. I mean, nobody fell on their sword as a result of this really either, did they?
no, nobody did. And I think, in fairness to Guzetta, he had built a very solid foundation up to then. It wasn't as if he was a new CEO coming in, took a big
Yeah.
risk, and it all went to hell. He had made a big success prior to this. One question that came to me, I was like, okay, so if the Pepsi challenge was so good, and if Pepsi generation is so good, then how come Pepsi still haven't taken over Coke?
Yes.
And the reason for that is, again, because of Guzetta. Guzetta brought out this mega brand strategy. It started with Diet Coke, and it continued when he brought in all these other caffeine-free Diet Coke, caffeine Coke, and now you have Coke Zero. You get as many Coke drinks under the one umbrella. You build a bigger brand, and that strengthens the whole brand of Coke. And New Coke only bolstered this. Okay, it was negative for 2 months, but then once they changed it back to the original Coke, it became positive, and it still fed into this whole thing that Coke is everywhere. When you go into the shops now, Coke has more shelf space. They have more ads promoting more drinks. They have a larger consumer base. And this all feeds into a mega brand strategy that Coke has been using since Guzetta developed it. And it has just, Pepsi hasn't come close. If you look at Pepsi now, Pepsi has 8.9% of the cola market share in the US. Coke has 17.4%. So the Coke brands and that mega brand Coke strategy has worked fantastically. And yeah, Guzetta didn't get fired, Keogh didn't get fired, and they were right not to get fired, because if you look at Guzetta, when he came into Coke in 1980, it had a market cap of 4.3 billion. He stayed on until 1996, and when he left, it had a market cap of 152 billion. So he was one of the most successful CEOs in corporate history in the 20th century. So they were
So
right.
this is one of the most successful mistakes made then, really, when you think about it.
It was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
There's nothing like, I was reading a lot of different articles where they were saying it's not a case study that you can really say this is how you do it, because it kind of confounds all case studies.
Yes, it does.
Like there was nothing you could say, this is how you bounce. Well, no, I mean, in fairness, one thing you could learn from it, and that Guzetta did very well, is once you realize you make a mistake, you own up to it and move as quick as you possibly can to rectify it.
Yeah. And make a virtue out of it.
Yeah. It was, I thought it was a fascinating story. What did you get out of it? That kind of thing as well?
Yeah, I think for me, I think probably it's a little bit like your view around the branding piece. It's probably, for me, maybe an underestimation of the intangible values that people put into a brand.
Yeah.
That people put in lots of, associations, be it memories or nostalgia or cultural type kind of feelings into a brand, that it's very hard to figure out in any sort of scientific research. And the extent to which the pillars of those sorts of things are eroded by a formula change probably weren't even conceived of. And I can remember in the books there was a piece saying, well, that's because he wasn't an Atlanta man. He wasn't a Coke man. He would never have made those decisions if he'd understood the value of the intangible memories and associations with Coca-Cola. He would never have killed a sacred cow. And that may be the case, but then he wouldn't have made all of the successful changes either. And that's why he was hired. So I think it's a complex story. I think for me, the one part that really jumps out though really is, how do you value those intangible kind of brand values? It's almost impossible to quantify what a brand means to someone.
Yeah.
But the reaction shows it means a lot.
Yeah. And it's hard to blame Guzetta for much, but I think taking something away from your most loyal fans, is like, that was the one thing where I was like, no, you just can't do that, because I know, like, we didn't get New Coke. but back in my 20s, I was a bit of a Coke addict. And if I had been told that Coke was going to just take it away from me, I would have got nuts. Like,
Yes.
what are you doing, man? So
Yeah.
that was, and as you said, it's nearly, there's a lot of intangible factors as to why I love the taste of Coke. But there was a lot of other things I loved about just having a Coke as well that you can't really define or put a value on. So it's very interesting. Okay, well, listen, that was a good one, Keith.
Good chat.
Good chat.
Your turn next time, so keep me posted.
Yeah, I haven't got anything in mind, but I'll let you know. All right.
All right. Cheers.
See you, Keith.
Bye.